In the universe of Dune, immortality rarely looks like a reward. Emperor Paul Atreides could see the future, yet he could not free himself from it. His son, Leto II, lived for more than 3,500 years, gradually transforming into a monster. The Reverend Mothers carried the memories of dead ancestors within themselves, always risking the loss of their own identities. But Duncan Idaho's fate may have been the most terrifying of all. He never asked for immortality. He never tried to conquer death. He did not seek the secret knowledge of the Bene Gesserit, and he never tried to become a god. He simply died one day while defending House Atreides. Then he was brought back. Later, he died again, and once again he returned. For roughly 5,000 years, different powers grew new versions of Duncan Idaho, awakened the dead swordmaster's memories inside them, and used them as soldiers, advisors, lovers, teachers, genetic material, and weapons in political struggles. Every new Duncan opened his eyes in a world he did not know. He met the descendants of people he had once served. He learned that his friends had long since turned to dust, while the name Atreides had become a religion, an empire, and eventually a justification for monstrous tyranny. And almost every time, Duncan did the same thing. He rebelled. Why did an ordinary man with no prophetic gift become the only character to pass through all 6 of Frank Herbert's original novels? Why was Paul Atreides given his dead friend as a gift? Why did Leto II bring Duncan back hundreds of times, even though he knew perfectly well that Duncan would eventually try to kill him? And after hundreds of lives and hundreds of deaths, what remains of a human being? Let us try to find out. Frank Herbert tells us almost nothing about Duncan Idaho's childhood. By the time he appears in the first novel, he is already a swordmaster of Guinas, an exceptional fighter, pilot, scout, and one of Duke Leto's most trusted men. A more detailed backstory appeared later in the books of Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. According to that version, Duncan was born on Gedi Prime, lost his parents at an early age, and nearly became living prey during one of Glasu Raban's brutal hunts. He survived, escaped the Harkonnen planet, and eventually reached Caladan. The Atreides gave the fugitive everything he had never known before: protection, status, and a purpose. After serving at court, Duncan trained at the Guinas Swordmaster School and returned as one of the finest swordmasters in the known universe. Perhaps the contrast between the Harkonnens, who treated people as disposable material, and the Atreides, who tried to earn the loyalty of their subjects, shaped the rest of his life. Duncan did not serve the house merely out of duty. To him, the Atreides were proof that power could take a different form. Duncan became one of Duke Leto's 3 principal military advisors, alongside Thuthufer Hawat and Gurney Halleck. He carried out missions that demanded combat mastery, the instincts of a spy, and absolute personal loyalty. Duncan also trained Paul Atreides. To the young heir, he was not only a teacher but someone close enough to make him forget, if only briefly, about politics and destiny. When House Atreides was granted control of Arrakis, Duncan was the first of their people sent to the Fremen. He did not treat them like savages. He lived among them, studied their customs, and earned Stilgar's respect. The Swordmaster was among the first to realize that the desert concealed not a scattering of isolated tribes, but an enormous military force. Yet the alliance came too late to save House Atreides. The trap laid by the Emperor and the Harkonnens was already closing. Dikter Yu's betrayal opened Arrakine's defenses to the enemy. The Atreides army was destroyed, Duke Leto was killed, and Duncan managed to find Paul and Lady Jessica and help them reach shelter. He then remained behind at the ecological testing station to hold off the Sardaukar for a few precious moments. Duncan knew he would not survive the fight. He killed 19 of the Imperium's finest soldiers and died carrying out his final order. The story of the loyal swordmaster could have ended there. Instead, his body was preserved and delivered to the Bene Tleilax. Duncan's first death was not an ending, but the beginning of an experiment that would continue for thousands of years. The Tleilaxu possessed technologies that inspired fascination and disgust in equal measure. In their axletal tanks, they could grow golas, new bodies created from the cells of dead people. A gola looked almost identical to the original person, but remembered nothing of the life that had come before. Hate was such a being. His name can be translated as life, a choice that carried the Tleilaxu's characteristic sense of mockery. A body grown from dead flesh had been given a name meaning life, yet it lacked the memories that made that life human. The Tleilaxu restored Duncan's body, replaced his eyes with metallic prostheses, and gave him a new education. Hate became a mentat, a human trained to perform extraordinarily complex logical calculations, as well as a Zensuni philosopher. From the original Duncan, he retained his appearance, fighting abilities, and faint, almost imperceptible emotional reactions. But he had no memories. Hate knew who the body had been before death, yet he did not feel that he was that man. Years after Paul Atreides' victory, the Gola was presented to the new emperor as a gift. The gift, of course, was poisoned. The conspirators understood that an ordinary assassin had almost no chance of approaching the Kwisatz Haderach. Paul could see countless possible futures, recognize deception, and surround himself with Fremen willing to die at a word from him. But Duncan Idaho held a unique place in the Emperor's memory. He reminded Paul of Caladan, of his dead father, and of the time before the Atreides heir became Muad'Dib, the name under which billions were killed across the universe. Hate was meant to act as a form of psychic poison. His very presence forced Paul to return to the past and ask himself what he had become. At the same time, an assassin's command had been hidden inside the Gola. The dwarf Bijas could activate it with a particular vocal intonation. When, after Chani's death, Paul spoke the words, acknowledging that she was gone, Hate was supposed to kill the Emperor. The Tleilaxu had built an almost perfect trap. They had overlooked only one thing. Duncan Idaho's loyalty ran deeper than memory. After Chani's death, the implanted command was indeed activated. Hate saw Paul before him, broken by grief. The command demanded that he kill him. Everything the Tleilaxu had taught, the Gola drove him toward the fatal blow. But another part of his identity resisted. The man before Hate was not merely an emperor. He was Duke Leto's son, the boy Duncan had once trained and for whom he had already died. The conflict between the artificial command and Duncan's buried loyalty became so intense that the Gola's mind could no longer contain it. And then his memories returned. Hate remembered Caladan. He remembered Duke Leto, Jessica, and the young Paul. He remembered the Fremen, the fall of Arrakeen, and his final battle. He even remembered his own death. For the first time, a Gola had fully recovered the original person's identity. For Paul, the discovery was more terrifying than any weapon. The Tleilaxu immediately offered him a bargain. They could bring Chani back. They could grow her a new body, then apply the right psychological pressure and awaken her memories. The price was predictable: power, wealth, and submission. Paul refused. He understood that a new Chani would become the same kind of hostage Duncan had nearly become. Love turned into a technology of control is no longer salvation. Hate finally cast aside the name he had been given and became Duncan Idaho once more. Yet the return of his memories did not make him an exact copy of the dead swordmaster. His old identity was now joined by mentat abilities, philosophical training, and the experience of living without a past. The first Gola was both Duncan and something more. That would become the rule for every incarnation that followed. After the blinded Paul walked into the desert, Duncan remained beside Aaliyah and became her husband and mentat. Their union can hardly be described as an ordinary love story. Aaliyah had grown up carrying the memories of dead ancestors and had been denied the right to be an ordinary child. Duncan also lived in a body that felt foreign to him and carried the memory of his own death. Perhaps it was this loneliness that drew together two people who both felt the presence of the past inside themselves. To Duncan, Aaliyah was more than the regent. She was still the daughter of Duke Leto and Lady Jessica, the last living part of the family for whom he had already died. By staying near her, he seemed to be trying to restore his lost connection to Caladan and to the Atreides he had once known. Aaliyah, in turn, gained a husband who did not worship her as Muad'Dib's sister and who could speak to her without religious fear. But Duncan gradually realized that he was losing his wife. The inner voice of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen exerted more and more control over Alia. Suspicion, spice dependence, and the hunger to hold on to power displaced the woman he had tried to protect. The most horrifying part was that Alia still stood before him in outward form, while her words and decisions increasingly belonged to the enemy who had destroyed House Atreides. Duncan's conflict with the regent was therefore more than a political rebellion. He was watching the woman he loved disappear, and he understood that loyalty alone could no longer save her. To oppose Alia meant betraying his wife. To remain beside her meant betraying everything that had once made the Atreides worthy of his loyalty. Exposing the truth was not enough. Stilgar and his Fremen could see what Alia's rule was becoming, but fear of civil war and the habit of obeying Muad'Dib's family kept them from openly resisting. Duncan decided to deprive his old friend of the option of remaining neutral. In Siege-Tober, he killed Javid, Alia's advisor and lover, and then deliberately insulted Stilgar by striking at the most sensitive part of a Fremen's identity, his honor. Stilgar killed Duncan and understood the plan only after the blow had been struck. The death of the regent's husband made reconciliation with Alia impossible. The Naib now had to flee and join her enemies. For Duncan, this was both a political calculation and a final admission of personal defeat. He could no longer bring his wife back, so he gave his life to stop the regime she had created. Thus, Duncan died for the second time. The first time, he had saved Paul from the enemies of House Atreides. The second time, he saved the memory of the Atreides from the Atreides themselves. But this death would not be his last. Paul's son, Leto II, chose the golden path and transformed himself into a hybrid of a human and a sandworm. For more than 3,500 years, he maintained absolute power, suppressing wars, restricting travel, and locking humanity into a state of artificial peace. The old world disappeared. The Fremen became a museum exhibit, the great houses lost their former strength, and the name Atreides became part of a state religion. And throughout those centuries, Duncan Idaho repeatedly appeared beside the good emperor. Whenever one Ghola died, Leto ordered another. A young swordmaster would awaken, carrying memories of Duke Leto, Paul, and the fall of Arrakeen, only to discover that everyone he had ever known was long dead, and that the child who bore his duke's name had become a being worshipped throughout the Imperium. The exact number of Duncans is unknown. There were hundreds, and most died violently. Some fought in wars, others joined conspiracies, and many tried to kill Leto himself, only to die by his hand, or at the hands of the fish speakers. Every new Duncan followed the same path. First he tried to understand the future world, then he saw the prison created by the good emperor, and eventually he rebelled. To Duncan, this was an endless betrayal by the Atreides. He gave them his lives, and they kept bringing him back without consent, forcing him to serve an order he despised. To Leto, however, each new Ghola was more than a soldier or a source of genetic material. Duncan was the last living voice of the world in which Leto could still have been merely human, and in which the name Atreides had not yet come to mean divine power. Leto knew Duncan's character perfectly well. He understood that every incarnation would eventually turn against him, yet that was precisely why he continued to bring Duncan back. Duncan did not recognize a god in the good emperor. He saw only the heir of the family he had once served, and he never hesitated to call tyranny by its name. Every Ghola became a moral judgment upon Leto. Everyone else either worshipped the ruler, feared him, or tried to use him. Duncan alone could hate him openly. Leto killed him for that honesty, then found himself unable to accept the final disappearance of the only person still connected to his human past, and ordered another copy. Their relationship combined attachment, guilt, need, and cruelty. There was also, of course, a practical reason. Leto incorporated Duncan's descendants into his breeding program. But genetics alone cannot explain why the good Emperor tolerated an accuser at his side for centuries. Leto needed Duncan as proof that beneath the worm's body and thousands of years of absolute rule, some memory of the Atreides boy still remained. To Duncan, however, Leto's attachment was simply another form of violence. He was loved so intensely that he was never allowed to die for good. The final Duncan of the good Emperor's reign was once again a man from the past, trapped in an incomprehensible future. Leto appointed him commander of the Fish Speakers, but the old-fashioned swordmaster was disgusted by their religious worship and increasingly felt like a valuable object removed from storage whenever a new task arose. He grew close to Siona Atreides, the leader of the resistance. Siona was the result of a breeding program that had lasted for centuries. She and her future descendants could not be seen through prescient vision. As long as one prescient ruler could observe all of humanity, that ruler could control it or destroy it. Siona's descendants were meant to ensure that no future tyrant could ever possess such power again. To complete the program, Leto intended to pair her with Duncan, once again treating Duncan's body as genetic material. But the most painful connection between Duncan and Leto was Huinari. In a world built on intrigue and calculation, her gentleness seemed almost impossible. Duncan saw in her someone who did not treat him as a gola, a relic, or a collection of valuable genes. Intimacy grew between them, but he was bound to Leto and understood the Gid Emperor's loneliness in a way Duncan neither wanted nor was able to understand. Their rivalry was therefore not an ordinary struggle between two men over a woman. Duncan hated the tyrant, yet he could see that he was capable of loving the fragment of humanity still alive inside him. Leto possessed almost unlimited power, yet he could not force her feelings to become simple. Hui herself stood between a man with whom she might have shared an ordinary life and a being for whom ordinary life was forever impossible. Duncan and Siona destroyed a bridge during a royal procession. Leto fell into the water, and his body began to break apart, releasing sand trout. Hui died with him. For Duncan, victory over the tyrant immediately became a personal loss. He had achieved Leto's death, but he had failed to save the woman who had made him feel the value of an ordinary human life more sharply than ever before. The good Emperor knew about the conspiracy and had created the conditions for his own death. Even Duncan's rebellion was part of the Golden Path, and yet the plan could be completed only by someone who sincerely refused to obey. Leto used Duncan's freedom, but without that freedom, humanity could never have escaped the cage he had built. After Leto II's death came the scattering. Humanity, held inside a single system for thousands of years, poured beyond the boundaries of the known worlds. Siona's descendants, whose genetic line also carried Duncan's legacy, remained invisible to prescient sight. No new oracle could ever again see and control all of humanity at once. Duncan had helped complete a plan he hated. That was Leto's final cruelty. He had transformed his friend's genuine resistance into a necessary part of his own design, yet the result did not belong to the good Emperor alone. Without Duncan's stubbornness, anger, and inability to submit, the Golden Path would have remained nothing more than the calculation of a single tyrant. Roughly 1,500 years after the good Emperor's death, the universe had changed again. New powers were returning from the scattering, and the honored matres were among the most dangerous. Preparing for war, the Bene Gesserit once again commissioned a Gola of Duncan Idaho. Many previous attempts had ended with the Gola's death before his memories could be awakened, as though someone feared the emergence of this particular version. The young Duncan was placed under the protection of Milesteg. Reverend Mother Lucilla was supposed to bind him to the Order through sexual imprinting. The Sisterhood saw him as a way to influence Shiana. The Tleilaxu had hidden a program of their own inside his body. Once again, Duncan was a man whose purpose had been decided before he even remembered his name. Milesteg awakened his original memories through an extreme psychological shock, but this time, something far greater lay hidden behind the memories of the first Duncan. The honored matre Merbella tried to dominate Duncan through sexual conditioning. Instead, the Tleilaxu's secret program turned against her. Duncan not only resisted the imprinting, but bound Merbella to him. Their relationship began as a struggle for control, with each attempting to take away the other's freedom. The bond that formed between them was physical, psychological, and emotional at the same time. Merbella could not simply leave Duncan. While he could not consider himself free beside a woman whose desire had been intensified by techniques of mental control, over time, their mutual dependence developed into genuine feeling, but that only made the relationship more painful. Neither of them could ever be certain where the programming ended and love began. During his confrontation with Merbella, the memories of Duncan's previous incarnations opened inside his mind. He remembered not only his first life and his existence as hate. He recovered his love for Aaliyah, his death at Stilgar's hands, his countless awakenings at the court of Lee. To the second, his rebellions, defeats, lovers, children, and all the bodies in which he had been born again. He was no longer merely another Gola. Hundreds of separate lives had merged into a single consciousness. Reverend Mothers carried the memories of their ancestors, but Duncan carried many versions of himself. Each began with the same original memories, then made different choices and died a different death. The final Duncan was not a copy. He was an entire people contained within one man. The Bene Gesserit did not dare allow such a Duncan to move freely. They kept him aboard a no-ship, hidden from prescient observation. The Sisterhood needed his abilities, yet feared a being who contained thousands of years of experience. Duncan could sense the presence of unknown observers, Daniel and Marty, watching him as though he were a piece in someone else's game. By this time, Merbella had completed Bene Gesserit training and accepted responsibility for uniting the Sisterhood with the honored Matres. A powerful bond still existed between her and Duncan, but their paths were separating. Merbella chose power and responsibility for millions of lives. Duncan, who had spent his entire existence trapped by other people's duties, chose the possibility of leaving. Shiana seized the no-ship. She was joined by the Gola of Miles Tegg, Skytail, several Reverend Mothers, members of an ancient Jewish community, Sandworms, and Duncan. When the unknown observers tried to capture the vessel in their net, Duncan managed to escape and destroyed the navigation records so that no one aboard could return by the route they had taken. This is where the story written by Frank Herbert ends. Duncan leaves behind not only the Bene Gesserit, but also Merbella, the woman with whom he shared love, dependence, and mutual domination. For the first time in thousands of years, he is heading somewhere no emperor, Tleilaxu Master, or Sisterhood has ordered him to go. He chooses the unknown for himself. In the continuation novels by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, Daniel and Marty are revealed as incarnations of the machine intelligence, Omnius, and the robot Erasmus. Duncan becomes the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach and a mediator between humanity and the machines. This ending resolves the mysteries left behind, but it also changes the nature of the character. In Frank Herbert's novels, Duncan's strength lay primarily not in becoming a new messiah, but in preserving his own will. Readers must therefore decide for themselves whether the later conclusion is a logical culmination or a departure from the character's original meaning. Duncan seems like an ordinary man only when standing beside prophets, Reverend Mothers, and the good Emperor. That is precisely why he matters. He remembered the Atreides before their name became a religion, and he could compare every new form of power, not with some grand prophecy, but with simple ideas of honor and loyalty. Duncan is far from perfect. He is proud, hot-tempered, capable of cruelty, and often makes decisions under the influence of personal feelings. But a moral standard can only be a living human being, not an infallible symbol. His value lies not in perfection, but in the fact that after every return he remained capable of judging the very people he had once served. Strictly speaking, Duncan did not live continuously for 5,000 years. The original died on Arrakis, and every Gola began as a new body that accumulated its own experience after the memories were awakened. Years or centuries passed between incarnations. They were connected by a shared original memory and a recurring character, but every life was still a separate life. Duncan's true immortality was not the survival of his flesh, but the survival of his ability to choose. The Tleilaxu brought back a weapon. Leto brought back a servant. The Bene Gesserit brought back a tool. But every time the memories returned, so did a man capable of refusing the role prepared for him. The final Gola absorbed all the lives that came before and transformed that long succession of refusals into a single identity. Duncan Idaho died for the first time while saving Paul. The second time, he sacrificed himself to stop Aaliyah. Hundreds of later incarnations rebelled against Leto II, and the final Duncan carried the memories of all those lives within him. For thousands of years, rulers, breeders, and secret orders treated him as their property. Each believed it could restore the right body, awaken the right memories, and obtain the person it needed. But Duncan's memories never brought obedience. They brought back the right to judge his creators. That is why Duncan's story is not the story of a man who defeated death. It is the story of a man who was never allowed to die, yet could never be completely ordered how to live. Perhaps that was his true immortality, not existing forever, but becoming himself again after every death.